The fate of Dominic Raab could be decided today. The row about the logos of Manchester's big football clubs, and have politicians been too squeamish about tackling obesity? This is Politics Live. With me today, the former Conservative Party chairman, Jake Berry, Shadow Treasury Minister James Murray, Liberal Democrat MP Munira Wilson, and former Brexit Party MEP and now non-affiliated peer Baroness Claire Fox. Today, Dominic Raab's political future hangs in the balance. The report into allegations of bullying into Mr Raab has been delivered to the Prime Minister. We'll have the latest. This plane was meant to take asylum seekers to Rwanda, but European judges blocked it. Will a new law stop that from happening again? Campaigners say these football club logos are linked to the slave trade. Is it time to change them?
I've always wanted to lose weight for ages and ages, and I think many people, I struggle with my weight.
And successive governments have tried to tackle obesity. Why do they keep failing? So you will have heard there in the headlines that after a 5-month investigation into multiple allegations of bullying against the Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary Dominic Raab, the report that has been carried out by Adam Tolley KC has landed at number 10. It's with the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and a number 10 spokesperson has said that Mr Sunak is considering its findings. And we will have the report released in full by number 10 once Rishi Sunak has made his decision about what to do. Let's talk to the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason. Chris, it's taken a very long time by most people's metric. How difficult a decision is this going to be for the Prime Minister? Because ultimately, what happens to Dominic Raab is his decision.
It is the Prime Minister's judgment, and it's a big one. Of course it is, because it's about the fate of his deputy, his loyal servant, if you like, someone who campaigned alongside him to the bitter end last summer when he was defeated, as you'll remember, by Liz Truss, then appointed as Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary when Rishi Sunak came into government as Prime Minister. What we know as of the last half an hour is that the Prime Minister has the report from Adam Tolley, 5 months in the gestation, 150-odd days. He is considering its findings. We know from the time that it's taken to compile it that it is a hefty piece of work. We also know that the Prime Minister is an assiduous reader of documents and will make sure he's had a good old proper read of it before we hear his conclusions. But this is now live. The clock is ticking before we hear from number 10. The question will be just how long. I think given its longevity, it doesn't necessarily mean it's suddenly going to pop up in the next 5, 10, 15 minutes or even the next hour or two, but it's going to pop up sooner rather than later, pretty soon.
There's been an awful lot of discussion about how definitive this report will be, the judgment of Adam Tolley, in terms of whether or not Dominic Raab has breached the ministerial code, whether his behaviour breached the ministerial code in terms of the way he treated staff. Do we have any more intelligence around that?
So, we know that Adam Tolley, as a KC, as a senior lawyer, is not someone who has been employed to definitively answer whether or not Dominic Raab's behaviour has breached the ministerial code. It is to assemble the facts about what happened and to speak to Mr Raab and also those who had complained about his behaviour and those who had witnessed his behaviour. Assemble that, then plonk it on the Prime Minister's desk and allow the Prime Minister to come to a judgment. Now, I know there were conversations at the very highest level of government during the last 5 months trying to hope, from the government's point of view, that Mr Tolley would be sufficiently direct and specific about his view about the appropriateness or otherwise of the behaviour, that it would help the Prime Minister reach a judgment. And there's a bit of back and forth about the extent to which that has happened, and we'll see when we see the report the extent to which that has happened. So Mr Tolley doesn't have to say, and hasn't been tasked with saying, this is a breach of paragraph whatever of the ministerial code, but clearly if he is either specific in his conclusions or if the volume, breadth, and depth of testimony is sufficiently strong, then perhaps the political decision for the Prime Minister will be less difficult than it might otherwise be. There are plenty within government who have long thought that they thought this would be something that would be very hard for Dominic Raab to politically survive. And there are certainly those who are saying that this lunchtime. There are others, though, who have always said, look, he might be quite a taskmaster as a boss, but they don't think that that has ever amounted to bullying. And we should say Dominic Raab has consistently denied that he is a bully.
Chris Mason, BBC's political editor, thank you very much. Jake Berry, Dominic Raab has said if an allegation of bullying is upheld, I would resign. But as we've just heard there, it may not be that definitive. What do you make of the whole process? It's taken a very long time. There have been multiple allegations denied by Dominic Raab, as Chris Mason has said. Should he have stayed in post, though, as Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary while this was going on?
Well, my view is absolutely not. The allegations go back some 18 months. You're right, Dominic Raab has denied them. We have an outdated system of dealing with both ministers and MPs, which many of us are around. There's all parliamentarians around this table. We should deal with this like we would deal with it with any major employer. If you're subject to a serious allegation which can be shown not to be vexatious, and I haven't seen any of the facts on this, then there should be a process in which you step back to enable that investigation to take place. It's what our constituents would expect if they worked in a supermarket or in an office environment, or in fact any work environment. I don't see why politicians should be different, and I think it's now an opportunity for Rishi Sunak, having commissioned, in all fairness, this independent report, to make his decision, but then make a longer-term decision about whether this system that we're going through is appropriate for the modern day.
Right, so you'd like that change. Do you agree with that, James?
Well, look, what I agree with is actually what this shows about Rishi Sunak and his judgment, because he appointed Dominic Raab as his deputy, despite knowing the reputation Dominic Raab had more widely.
And the allegations.
Yeah, the allegations, but also on the point that Jake made around, suspending Dominic Raab whilst the investigation is ongoing. There are questions of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister to answer why he didn't do that. And if it's proven to be, or if the conclusion is there's been a breach of the ministerial code, then obviously he should be sacked immediately.
Right, and if that is found, whether or not Adam Tolley makes it absolutely crystal clear, but if the implication is there that there has been a breach of the code, should Rishi Sunak just sack Dominic Raab?
Well, look, you're asking me to get into speculate.
No, I'm just asking if that is the scenario.
Maybe in a report that I haven't seen, but, there is a reason that people get suspended in the work environment. It's very difficult to bring a complaint against someone who's more senior than you in your business, or in this case in your department. The guy is the Deputy Prime Minister, and I think that's why it's long overdue, this reform. And by the way, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. We should be making similar changes with members of Parliament. And in my brief period as party chairman, one of the things I did agree with Liz Truss is that we would start to take this different approach, and in relation to the issues we ran into, we did.
Right, I mean, people will remember the former Home Secretary, Priti Patel, also investigated, and the conclusion there was that she had breached the ministerial code, and Boris Johnson chose not to sack her. That was a mistake?
Well, it's a matter for Boris that I've been really clear. This isn't about Dominic Raab, from my point of view. This is about a completely outdated system
that
treats MPs and ministers as some sort of special human being, and I don't think that's right.
Munira?
Well, first of all, we need to see this report published in full as soon as possible.
Well, they've said they're going to do that.
I agree with Jake that Dominic Raab should have been suspended while the investigation was ongoing. I think the key question for me is, what did the Prime Minister know when? Because Raab has been one of his most loyal lieutenants, right by his side throughout his leadership campaign last summer, even when it was clear that he was going to lose to Liz Truss. And yet he appointed him as his Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary. And as you've pointed out, we've had allegations, and in fact a report on Priti Patel in the past where bullying was found to have taken place. And we've even already had in Rishi Sunak's government the resignation of Gavin Williamson over bullying claims and text messages. This is a Prime Minister who has staked his premiership on integrity and accountability. So I would hope he will be taking firm action once, depending on what the report says.
Claire?
I think the reason why this is trickier than you'd think is that, I really hate workplace bullying, but the category that constitutes bullying has become ever elastic and expanded over many years. That's both in schools and in everywhere. And bullying accusations are now levelled against people for all sorts of reasons that are not what we would normally constitute bullying.
And that's why there's been this report.
Exactly. So I don't know what's in the report. The reason I'm just trying to give, so that I don't just repeat everything. So the reason I'm saying that is because some of the things that were leaked about Dominic Raab's behaviour, and I think Chris Mason made this point, was like hard taskmaster. We can't be in a situation where people are not able to expect certain things from people at work without them saying that's bullying. And that happens all the time. And even when I, as a trade unionist in the past, I was defending people who were accused of bullying for all sorts of egregious reasons. And you do think, actually, they're just trying to do their job. So I get nervous about that. And just as I would not want Dominic Raab to be saved because of a political bias on Rishi Sunak's part, I also wouldn't want him to be sacked for political reasons either, where he feels that if he doesn't do it, people will say he's being soft on bullying. So, in other words, I just think it's not as black and white as people suggest at all.
All right. Well, we're going to move on, actually, Jake, because we haven't got the report as yet. So let's wait until we have sight of it, or a decision by Rishi Sunak on the findings that have landed at number 10. We're going to talk about small boats, one of the pledges by the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. Let's have a look at some headlines. This is in the Eye. Rishi Sunak set to toughen Channel migrants' bill to avoid right-wing Tory rebellion, say insiders. And I think we have another headline to look at, and this is in The Sun. EU, you're overruled. Ministers will change law to ignore Euro judges blocking deportation flights. Now, this is looking at the fact that ministers are trying to toughen the illegal migration bill, which some Conservative backbenchers have been calling for. It would allow this proposed change, the government, to ignore interim injunctions from the European Court of Human Rights. That, of course, is completely separate from the European Union. And a separate change would mean that British judges can only halt deportations where there is a risk of what they call serious and irreversible harm. Now, the bill is going to be back in the Commons next week. Does it need to be tougher, this bill, or not, Jake?
Well, I think this is a good idea, and maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned, but I think as legislation goes through Parliament, it's subject to debate, and that's an opportunity for backbench MPs like me and opposition MPs to improve the legislation. I think this is an improvement.
You do? Why?
Absolutely. Well, I think the British people expect our government to have a sovereign immigration policy as an independent, country outside the European Union.
Which it has.
And the government to uphold that in all cases. I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation, particularly when what we are actually trying to do is stop vile people traffickers, in effect killing many people as they cross the channel. I think we should leave no stone unturned to protect people.
All right. Well, let me get the other guests in. James, what's your view in terms of breaking the business model, in terms of deterring people getting into the boats? Do you think it needs to be toughened up, the bill?
Well, look, I think what the Home Secretary is talking about today is an effort to distract from the failure of the gimmick of the Rwanda policy in the first place. The Rwanda policy has been a total failure, a total gimmick. And what we said, from the beginning, is the money that the government wants to spend on the Rwanda policy should instead be spent on that cross-border police force to stop those criminal gangs in the first place. Because we need to make sure that the criminal gangs operating these small boats are tackled at source, so that people stop dying and stop being trafficked into the UK. That's what we should be doing. And this is a distraction. This is trying to blame someone else for the failure of the Conservatives' policy here, and it's a sop to the backbenchers.
Jake?
Well, look, that would be a really valid point if it wasn't completely wrong, because, of course, Rishi Sunak is giving additional money to the French. When you say stop them at source, that means on the beach in Calais, not in the beach in Dover or wherever it may be. So this is part of a package of measures, including working with our counterparts in France. Look, you've got a really simple choice, actually. I think I'm the only person around this table in the Commons who's voted for this illegal migration bill. It's the government getting tough on immigration, people watching your show. I think that's what the people want.
But no one
has been sent.
But no one has been sent to Rwanda, have they?
You can vote Conservative, and we will get serious about maintaining a sovereign immigration policy.
Just to be clear, before I bring in everyone,
who set their face against.
Nobody has been sent to Rwanda.
Well, yeah, because it's being blocked by the courts, and that's exactly what this is designed to do. If you have a sovereign parliament, we should have no fear whatsoever of saying we will put through legislation which will ensure that we can deliver our own immigration policy.
Believe in the rule of law, Jake?
Absolutely, but the rule of law is made up of both common law, international law and legislation. It's absolutely clear. I'm not a lefty lawyer, I'm a righty lawyer, actually, but I say it is perfectly reasonable for a government which has a majority to pass legislation.
Let Munira continue.
I mean, the whole bill already undermines our legal obligations on refugees. Jake, you talked about what British people's expectations are. I think British people expect this government to uphold the rule of law and abide by international law. This political sleight of hand, which is yet further ramping up of all the hate and fear around refugees, is exactly what it is. It's a sop to the right-wingers on the backbenches to keep them happy and stop a rebellion. This bill and everything so far that Suella Braverman has done on asylum seekers is frankly immoral, unworkable and expensive. And let's remember, almost 50% of those people coming over in those small boats, almost 50% are coming from 5 countries that have over 80% asylum grant rates.
They're all coming from France.
Not originally.
We're an island. I'm not sure if you noticed. We're an island, so they have to get in a boat to get to here. If you're coming from Afghanistan...
They're not fleeing persecution.
Well, there are people fleeing persecution from Iran, from Afghanistan, from Sudan. They're taking perilous journeys, but they're coming to join their families. Jake, my mother came here in the 1960s as a stateless person who was fleeing potential danger in her home country. The reason she came here is because she had family members to come and join. That is why they're coming over here. I have countless cases. I've got 5 British children in hiding in Kabul with an Afghan mother who has no safe and legal route to come here. You've stopped your safe and legal routes.
Who are undermining the entire system.
If you want to fix...
I'm not going to have everyone talking over each other. First of all, you just said, 500,000 people came through safe and legal routes?
To the UK, the majority of them coming from Hong Kong, Ukraine and Afghanistan. We have one of the most open and welcome...
How many came from Afghanistan last year, Jake? How many came from Afghanistan?
I have to say, the schemes from Afghanistan have pretty well
But I'm saying there are safe and legal routes.
Let me get Claire in on this, because the issue is around stopping small boats. It's stopping them actually coming across the channel, people dying in those boats. Does the government have any case to make in the way that Jake has said, that this might work, could work, and actually break the business model?
So we need to untangle 2 things, because actually this item is about the amendments and about our attitude to whether Strasbourg makes the decisions or whether the UK Parliament makes a decision. And just as, Munira, you said, do you believe in the rule of law? I could say to you, do you believe in democracy? Because ultimately, democratic accountability in a sovereign country, in any sovereign country, has to mean that if the British electorate, who are in charge of all of us, they are more important than any of us, decide that this is the policy that they want, they don't want to hear that it's not possible because of judges in Strasbourg. And that's what all this controversy is about. Now, I have reservations about the illegal migration bill, but to a certain extent, it's a separate question, because what I think happens is, and certainly is what happens in the Lords, is whenever we have the conversation about the problem, and it is a crisis of the small boats, and it's a crisis in a range of ways, because it might well be that people are coming as economic migrants, and I don't say that as an insult, because I think it's perfectly understandable that a young 20-year-old would want a better life and would get in a boat. I get that. But whenever we try and have an honest, open discussion, 2 things happen. Either people say you can't do it because of the 1953 Refugee Convention or because of the EHRC and the law. And you can't do it, there is no alternative. It's anti-democratic, undermines the rights of the British people to make decisions, and politicians...
But people might ask, what evidence?
You can't have a truth, you can't have an honest discussion, because suddenly you're accused of wanting refugees to drown in the sea and you get called a racist. So I think that what I would like to do is to be able to have this discussion honestly and frankly. And one of the honest...
Well, hang on, Claire, because I need to get the others in too to respond to what you said. We do have these discussions, these honest discussions on this programme. On the programme we do, but it is also important to stick to facts, because I just want to show everybody this full fact quote, do any European countries send asylum seekers to Rwanda? Because the last time you were on, Jake, full fact responded to what you had said, where you said Denmark and other countries in the European Union had already implemented schemes to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda. Denmark isn't currently sending asylum seekers to Rwanda, and neither is any other EU country. So when people ask for evidence about whether this may work, there is no evidence elsewhere. I mean, do you want to withdraw what you said before because it wasn't correct?
Far be it for me to disagree with full fact. It may be that Denmark has a policy to do it and like us hasn't yet done it. But I think the point is this.
But they haven't done so now, which is what you said.
I accept that. But we have to do everything we can to stop these pull factors. And I think detaining people when they arrive in the UK, saying to people, if you come to this country legally, you will not be allowed to claim asylum, saying to people there is a danger you will be sent to a third country, whichever that may be, does massively reduce the pull factors, which is enticing these people to pay thousands of dollars to people trading in human misery across the Channel. I think it's an absolutely humanitarian approach.
James, what is wrong with that? Because what is Labour's plan to actually break this business model?
Well, what we said is the money that the government is spending on the Rwanda scheme, which isn't working, which I think we all accept is a gimmick, which is a failure, that money should go into this cross-border police force, which should help tackle those people traffickers at source.
There is money. All right, so you arrest and you jail. Hang on, you arrest and you jail those people traffickers, and then another lot of people traffickers come because the demand will still be there.
Yes, because we also need to work with our European allies on this to make sure that we're working cross-border. But the point is, Jake talks about how the government, is putting some money into this already. It's not working. It's clearly not adequately resourced to deal with the problem. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all these small boats crossing the Channel at the moment. The problem is there. We need to tackle the problem of small boats crossing the Channel, people dying. We need to go after the people smugglers. And when we need to invest money in that, we should spend the money on that rather than on the gimmick Rwanda policy.
Right, but in terms of spending money, Munira, what would the Liberal Democrats do to stop the small boats coming? Because, again, if you arrest criminal gangs, there'll be more people to take their place if you can still get across the Channel and come to the UK.
Well, there are two things you need to do to get rid of this pull factor. One is the safe and legal routes that I've already talked about, because we don't have many of those, but also having a far better functional asylum processing system. One of the biggest deterrents would be is if you knew that you would be processed and potentially deported back to where you came from if you don't have a credible claim, or given leave to remain if you do, then within the space of 6 months. That is more likely to deter people from taking that perilous journey. And we've got 166,000 people backlog. It's gone up by fourfold since 2019. I had somebody in my constituency surgery the other day who'd been waiting 8 years. I
think everyone will agree with dealing with the backlog. In terms of safe and legal routes, so as this bill is going through Parliament, Jake, would you like to see, alongside, in parallel, new safe and legal routes published, which the government says it would look at?
Yeah, I think that would be a really good idea. I mean, I think that part of Britain's culture is being a welcoming society. If you have an immigration policy, you have to demonstrate that it's not a fortress mentality and that you will welcome people who are genuinely fleeing persecution. But I don't think we should be encouraging people to cross the Channel in danger of their life.
It's a shame the Conservatives voted down a Liberal Democrat amendment to pilot safe and legal routes for a year from some of the most dangerous countries which have high asylum grant rates, which we did table. Labour abstained.
And would you have safe and legal routes from anywhere in the world where we have migrants?
There would be certain countries, such as Iran, for instance. We don't have a safe and legal route at the moment. I don't think you would need it from Albania, but you would from Iran. The Afghan citizen resettlement scheme is simply not functioning, and I have countless cases of people whose lives are in danger, whose family members are over here, and their family members are still stuck in Afghanistan because we're not allowing anyone over.
I'm going to just let Claire have the final word.
I've heard the rumour that there might be amendments and some flexibility on safe and legal routes, and I think that's an appropriate and sensible decision, because I think that... But however, I do feel as though some of this is disingenuous, because one of the things about the backlog is that we have a situation where, and you'll know this, we have got a crisis in the civil service. There's a real hostility to actually saying no to people, and what constitutes, and this has come up before, what constitutes gaining asylum status now is, as I said about bullying, is so broad and people know what to say. And that makes people feel as though they're being gaslit. Ordinary people are sitting there thinking, why doesn't somebody do something to stop it? And people say, because you want these people who are fleeing war, and they go, they're not fleeing war. And I think that's why I'm saying we've got to actually ratchet it down, not keep making it anti-Tory, or anti-Labour or anti-Lib Dem, but try and actually make sure that we honour what the British people want, which is to solve the small boats
Well,
crisis.
let's move on and talk about something different. The front page of The Sun. Footy supporters kick out. It says, ship hits the fan. I say that very carefully. This is about Manchester United and Manchester City football clubs and their badges. You can see there the logos, the crests there, and they both feature a three-masted ship at the top. That's been long associated with the city's trading past and history. But is it also an emblem of slavery? This story originates in The Guardian, which has been investigating the founders of the Manchester Guardian and their links to transatlantic slavery via the cotton industry. The Guardian's headline, Abandoned Ship, does this symbol of slavery shame Manchester and its football clubs? Let's talk to Kayinde Andrews. He is in our Birmingham studio, Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University and a Manchester United fan. Have you ever questioned, Kayinde, the badges on Manchester United?
Yeah, so recently I went to the International Slavery Museum in London. And there's a ship that looks very similar to the ship on the Man United badge. And it did make me question. And actually in that painting, they'd painted out all of the evidence this was a slave ship. And it's very similar to what's happened with these badges. I mean, like I said, I've been a fan for a very long time, never really thought about it. But if you think about it for more than about 5 minutes, it should make sense. Manchester was deeply involved in slavery. The cotton that built the city came through the port of Liverpool and the canal, up the canal to Manchester. And so this is definitely, well, undoubtedly, a symbol that links back to transatlantic slavery.
But it's interesting that up until very recently you hadn't really thought about it or questioned it, and presumably most Manchester United fans won't have done either.
Yeah, I think that just goes to show how deep the links generally that we have in Britain to slavery are, and we don't think about them. I mean, as a professor of Black Studies, you would think this would have crossed my mind earlier. But that's how insidious it is. And I think the idea that the pushback that this has nothing to do with slavery is frankly so ahistorical that it doesn't really deserve any credit at all.
Well, you say it doesn't deserve any credit, but Graham Stringer, Labour MP in Manchester, would strongly disagree with you. He has said, I don't think there is any evidence that the ship on the Manchester coat of arms, it's not just the football clubs, by the way, it's also, I think, on the council buildings, is anything to do with slavery. And I think the campaign of The Guardian is besmirching a rather proud history of radicalism that Manchester has got right up to the present day in terms of being well ahead of the game, to coin a phrase, in terms of all sorts of anti-discriminatory policies. A historian of the city, Jonathan Schofield, says the ship nods to the city's aspiration. It's a symbol of free trade rather than a definite link with slavery.
Well, I mean, what trade was this, though? Remember, Manchester, prior to the canal being built in the 1780s from Liverpool to Manchester, Manchester didn't exist as a city. Manchester boomed once they built this canal from Liverpool to the city. That brought in all the cotton. That's where you have this romance about the factory labour and all the trade unions. But that cotton, up until 1865, was produced almost exclusively on slave plantations in America. So when he says a symbol of free trade, it's a symbol of that trade. The trade which founded the city was undoubtedly the slave trade, which is why those ships were put in the city's emblem and why they were then put in the emblem of the football team.
Kayinde, I'm just going to get our other guests involved, but please stay with us for the discussion. Claire, do you agree?
Well, no, I disagree. One thing that's interesting about the history was that in 1861, Manchester cotton workers actually refused to deal with slave-created cotton. So the irony here is that if we're going to be historically specific, Manchester have got a fine tradition of fighting slavery, Manchester workers, that this is a symbol that's used in relation to a club that was started decades after slavery was abolished. And I feel that this is a rather narcissistic contemporary obsession with basically showing one's virtue by dealing with symbols. And in this instance, I think it's even more ridiculous because actually, as was indicated, nobody thinks that ship involves slavery. Nobody is wearing that badge thinking that shows my attachment to slavery. And it's making a trivial I think it trivialises slavery and the horrors of slavery when you basically say we can resolve what happened by taking the badge off. Okay. And that's why there's been a kickback across the political parties from fans from all sorts of political backgrounds.
All right, well, Kayinde, you're shaking your head.
Well, no, I mean, I think that you can say, look, there were some workers in Manchester who were anti-slavery. That doesn't change the fact that the whole entire city came off the wealth of slavery, and that's why that ship is celebrated. And just because the fact that we don't think about it in that way, and the fact that we don't think about it in that way, just shows us our historical ignorance.
That is not why that ship is celebrated.
It is what I'm sorry. It is. I'm sorry. There's no way possible to say that to celebrate trade to Manchester in that period of time is not linked to slavery.
Well, the Guardian, I do understand that the Guardian have form on this, because obviously they have just been exposed as, and are now rather embarrassedly running around, because they were actually actively pro-slavery. The point is, Manchester United and Manchester City were never pro-slavery because they didn't exist during that time. So what we're doing is basically ahistorically making a mockery of serious scholarship around slavery for the purposes of today, 2023, and basically saying we will feel better about ourselves. And actually, I just think, well, we've got so many things that we need to fight. Racism in the contemporary period and all the rest of it. This is both a distraction, and it makes people feel, I think that when people hear, oh, it's to do with slavery, we're basically making people cynical about serious anti-slavery acts.
It's about being honest about the country's history, which is deeply rooted in slavery.
Which you didn't know about.
Hang on, Claire. Yes, I mean, it's true, you didn't know, but go on, Kehinde.
Well, no, but this is being honest about it, and even saying that I didn't know, because we don't think about it. And just because a club came after slavery doesn't mean it isn't dependent on slavery, because Manchester wouldn't exist without slavery. Therefore, Manchester United, Manchester City wouldn't exist without slavery either. I mean, it's not about abolishing. And one thing I do agree, actually, the worst thing we could do here is say take the slave ship off the badge and then it's all good. That would be terrible. In fact, let's be honest about it. Maybe Man United should change their symbol to a white devil, not a red devil. I don't know. We just have to be honest about the history and about where we are.
Right,
that's what we're saying.
I mean, how do you do that, though? What do you make of this? Do you think because Manchester was at the centre of trade at that time, that automatically a symbol of a three-masted ship indicates that their wealth, as Kehinde is saying, from cotton mainly, is linked to slavery?
Well, look, I don't know enough about the history. Clearly, others are far more expert in that than I am. I think Kehinde's just said, actually, he doesn't necessarily support taking the ship off the crest. Far be it from me, both as a politician and as a Spurs fan, to tell Man U and Man City fans whether they should have the ship on the crest, and if they want to come over and support, a club with a cockerel, they're welcome to do so.
Fighting cocks.
Oh dear, there we go.
That's the Spurs are the fighting cocks.
There we go. I've got myself into trouble now, haven't I? But I think it's important to explore the history. It's important to have these conversations and understand our history. But ultimately, if there was a call to change the crest, it's up to the supporters and the clubs and not for politicians to opine.
James, did you know what the ship represented, even if you're not a Manchester United or Manchester City fan? Should people take enough interest to find out?
I think learning about the history is a good thing. I think there seems to be quite a healthy consensus here that these symbols shouldn't be removed from the logos, which is absolutely the right thing to do. Keep them on there, but learn about it. Learn about
but do you think, as Kehinde does, that it does actually have a link to slavery very clearly in his mind?
Well, look, I'm not a historian on this. I don't know all the ins and outs. I'm not going to pine on that. There are clearly different views, but let's have this discussion, right? Let's learn about our history. Let's learn about the history of the empire, the good, the bad, everything in between. Let's learn about the history of our country in all of its aspects.
Well, I agree that the sort of revisionist approach to this of deleting it from the badge does a huge disservice to people who are very concerned about the appalling legacy of slavery. And what really concerns me, not just with these badges, but more widely with the rewriting of books and and the things we read about in the press, is actually by airbrushing, to some extent, these appalling historical legacies out of history by removing the ship from the badge, which I think everyone has agreed will be a bad idea on this panel. In some ways, we sort of forget. And I think the point James makes about, let's educate people properly, let's talk about the good and the bad of Great Britain and her history, I think is the way to go.
Kehinde, why don't you think the ship should be removed from the crest?
I'm in two minds. I think I can see the argument for doing it if we accept that it is a link to slavery, and there are many fans like myself who are descendants of the enslaved. It is quite offensive and maybe you should remove it. But I do think it is also, you can't just do that. If that's all you're going to do, it's just a symbol. Actually, it's about addressing that history, and there are huge imbalances still in society that come from slavery, which people like me still suffer from. So actually, it's about much more than just saying, well, let's remove the badge, let's do a PR exercise. It's about a serious issue of reparations and justice.
Claire?
I walk past Cromwell's statue every day now that I go into Parliament, and from an Irish family, I could kind of basically not cope and say this is, you know, I'm a descendant of the victims of the Irish famine and so on and so forth. And the problem I've got is that we are erasing history. So rather than James's very sensible, you know, what everybody said really, which is everybody wants to deal with history. I wish, as a former teacher, that we had better history teachers and education, and that we were talking about history all the time. My concern is when history becomes politicised for contemporary political reasons, and that's what my concern is. There are ships with those sails, and the point that was made about, you know, Manchester made its money out of cotton trade. Those ships were undoubtedly ships historically might well have been dealing with cotton trade. You effectively say everything in our history should be either eradicated or
Is that what people are saying? Well, let Kehinde come back, because I'm not sure that is what he's saying.
I'm saying that if you were to say Manchester made its money out of the slave trade, once you've said that, I'm asking what you then do. Because my concern is that we become contemporarily obsessed with what happened in the past, and we've got social, political, anti-racist problems that we need to deal with.
Well, Kehinde, what do you do in answer to Claire's question?
The reason why you have to address those problems. And actually, the problems of racism are still very much with us. If you look at the wealth gap between black families and white families in this country, or look at the poverty in places like Jamaica, where my family is from, that's directly because of that history. It's not just in the past. So if you are going to deal with this, then it means reparatory justice, not just changing the emblem, which is why I'm not so for it, let's just change the emblem. But I do think there's a question for clubs where they say, as a brand, do we want to be celebrating slavery?
Right.
So actually, they probably should. The more I think about it, the more they should get rid of the symbol.
Oh, right. So you've come to the conclusion that they should get rid of the symbol.
Well, I think in a modern society, do you want to have a badge that says, oh, this is a link to slavery, that celebrates slavery? It's not, and taking it out of the Man United badge is not eradicating history. It's a brand. It is not history.
But Kehinde, would you accept
Manchester United's history?
Yeah, but Kehinde, would you accept that people aren't necessarily celebrating slavery if they don't know what that ship represents? Indeed, the way you didn't until quite recently.
But I think it's incumbent upon people to educate themselves, and once you do know, you shouldn't be as comfortable celebrating it. And quite frankly, if they took the ship off the badge, nobody would even notice. So I don't think it's that big a deal, to be quite honest, to have a corporate brand, a responsible brand.
And that's what I started saying in the first place. There's no big deal. Why are we having the conversation? Better things to talk about.
Well, excuse me, Claire.
No, not in relation to the programme, but how these things become headlines and turned into major political...
But that's a bit of a distraction tactic by The Guardian here.
That's what I'm suggesting.
You know, I think they're pretty...
No, well, hang on. These are important issues to discuss on whichever side you fall. Sorry, Kehinde, you were going to come in there.
No, I'm actually going to point out the reason these kind of topics get blown up is the right-wing press. The Guardian did something. A City fan had a perfectly reasonable reflection on the ship and what that means, and it wasn't the Guardian that posted. It was in the Sun and all the right-wing press that hyperventilates or trying to eradicate history. Culture wars, complete nonsense. There's a place to have this discussion, but this hyperventilating way around eradicating history is completely ridiculous.
Right. Well, we've had the discussion. I don't think anyone's hyperventilated so far. But Kehinde Andrews, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to talk about obesity. The Guardian, again, headline, nanny statism fears behind UK's 30-year failure to tackle obesity. This is a report by the Institute for Government suggesting that successive governments' failures to curb obesity is the result of ministers' fears around nanny statism. Over the last 30 years, there have been more than 14 strategies, hundreds of policies, institutionalising reforms, and they've all failed because the amount of obesity-related illness, such as type 2 diabetes, costs the NHS £6.5 billion annually. Why has it failed, Jake?
Well, I don't know why you've come to me first, but... No, so I saw this brilliant report yesterday, which I think The Guardian's referring to, about this new diet that has been proven to reverse type 2 diabetes for up to 5 years. Look, that's clearly a really good thing. People have to make it. We all have to look after our own health, and people have to make a decision. If you have type 2 diabetes, diabetes is 10% of the NHS budget currently, and that's before the people with expanding waistlines like me sort of come into our retirement. And if we can do something, then we should. And I think the challenge is, why has it failed, to answer you very directly, is because I think government is quite nervous about telling people what to do. I think there is a nervousness in government. I actually think that's wrong. But it shouldn't be the government doing it. It should be the NHS which changes to a health service that focuses on keeping you well and encouraging you to make the right lifestyle choices rather than one that treats you when you're ill. If we went back 40 years, people were probably saying, you know, well, don't you tell me to stop smoking. I'll smoke if I want to. But in fact, I think we're all probably quite glad that health campaigners and the NHS said,
like that.
Stop smoking. Well, I actually think people listen to the doctors more than they do to politicians. Stop smoking. It will make a massive difference to cancer survival rates and cancer rates in this country. We've seen the benefits of that. We should be doing the same thing with obesity and diabetes.
James, these are successive governments that have been criticised for failing to tackle obesity, and now the UK has one of the highest rates of obesity, certainly in Europe. Why do you think that is? Should the government have got more involved? Are they squeamish about dealing with it?
Well, I think you're right to highlight the impact obesity has, not just on the people who are affected directly themselves, who get diabetes and so on, but also in terms of taxpayers more widely. That figure, £6.5 billion, that's a huge amount to be spending. And so actually, if there are programmes that help people to move to a healthier lifestyle, that's a good thing. And I think we should be supporting that.
There are programmes, but should the government be advocating it? Should the government be intervening in a much more muscular way in terms of trying to bring down that figure and reduce the amount of obesity?
Well, look, I think we need that help to support people, to live a healthier lifestyle. I think we also need to be honest about, the wider context here. And I think this discussion at the moment, in particular, can't be had outside of the cost of living crisis, and the pressures that people have to afford food, to buy healthy food and so on, healthy food for themselves and their kids. All of that is part of the mix as well.
Munira?
Well, actually, I agree with Jake that there needs to be a much bigger focus on prevention rather than treating people once they become ill. We've heard how expensive this is as a condition for the NHS to treat. But also, remember, obesity is linked to so many other diseases. It's not just diabetes. And so those knock-on costs are enormous. And we've got to remember as well, it's about 3 times more expensive to buy healthy food rather than unhealthy food. And when you look at food inflation, it's actually been higher in terms of healthy food, something like 5% versus about 2.5% in unhealthy food. So we need to work, obviously, on the cost of living crisis to make healthy food more affordable for people, work on public health campaigns and prevention campaigns, but also regulation of industry. That is really important. This government has promised to ban advertising of junk food before the watershed, and that hasn't happened yet. And that does need to happen as well. Industry does have a responsibility in this.
Claire?
I'd say that soup and shake diets were
Which
around...
is the diet, I think, that Jake's
were
talking
around
about.
when I was at university. And I seem to recall...
And did they work?
I seem to recall it meant you didn't eat anything. I
Yes.
mean, soup and shake. I mean, we do know that if you don't eat anything apart from soup and a milkshake or whatever, those shakes, yes, you'll lose weight. So I thought that the kind of radical intervention bit was a bit much. But I think it's very tricky to say that you'd go for change your lifestyle or, to do your preventative work. The reason why it's very difficult is because I think there's a real danger here of blaming people for getting ill. And that's something that I'm very anxious that the NHS should avoid, where you say we won't treat you because you didn't live the way that you should have lived. I also do not think it's politically appropriate. I mean, I'm not a supporter of the nanny state, and I do worry when politicians start telling people how they should live their lives rather than, which is perfectly reasonable, giving them advice, right? I've got no objection to that.
But it doesn't work, does it? Well, I mean, I don't know if people recall Boris Johnson, the Battle of the Bulge, everyone get fit after lockdown. It was laughable, right? But if your doctor tells you to do something, you're much more likely to do it.
Lockdown was a public health measure that led to... Lockdown was a public health measure that led to huge numbers of people putting on a lot of weight.
But that's quite recent. That's quite recent.
No, but I'm just saying, when you say trust the public health group, I'm just pointing out that there are reasons why these things happen.
The current context has to be the cost of living crisis, though, because if the idea of people being told off for eating the wrong food and then saying, yeah, but I can't afford the healthier food, and that's what it comes down to at the moment.
But public health campaigns, like giving up smoking, have worked over time with quite stringent regulations from the government. You can't smoke anywhere in public, really, and it's worked.
But, I just don't think politicians telling people to eat less works. I think you say, why hasn't this worked? We've had Labour governments, Conservative governments, coalition governments. They've all tried to do it. It doesn't work. People listen to doctors. Yes, there's absolutely a role for government to introduce things like the sugar tax, which they brought in on fizzy drinks.
But I disagree. But why don't, say things like exercise? I wouldn't mind if it was more positive. Why don't you build cheap gyms that everyone can go to? That would be...
Well, let's finish on that idea of cheap gyms, not cheap gin, which I thought was what you said. That's all for today, but I'll be back tomorrow with Politics UK at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the BBC iPlayer. From all of us here, bye-bye.